John C. Cahalan once wrote a book if Wittgenstein had read Poinsot, recasting the problem of signs and mental states. Now, John C. Cahalan's article was published in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly in 1994, and what it does is it undertakes an ambitious comparative project to demonstrate that John Poinsot's 17th century theory of mental entities and signs, as reconstructed in John Deely's bilingual critical edition, Tractatus de Signes, the semiotic of John Poinsot, anticipates and dissolves the central difficulties that Ludwig Wittgenstein raises concerning mental states and meaning in the philosophical investigations. Cahalan's thesis is that Wittgenstein's arguments, far from refuting the existence of mental entities and the causes of signifying behaviour, actually confirm Poinsot's specific conception of such entities by eliminating the inadequate alternatives Wittgenstein himself considered. The article opens by identifying two foundational distinctions in Poinsot's semiotic theory, namely the first distinction between the psychological and the objective senses of mental terms, such as concept, or idea, or memory. In the psychological sense, a concept is a modification acquired by a knowing subject, a real change in the person who has learned something. When someone knows or learns what a quasar is, they acquire the psychological concept of quasar itself, a modification that could in principle be destroyed by being hit in the head, for example. In the objective sense, however, concept of a quasar refers not to the psychological modification, but to that to which the modification cognitively relates us, the intelligible content, the quasarness itself, which is not destroyed by trauma. This ambiguity is not just some confusion that needs to be eliminated, but it's an actual real feature of cognition itself. We discover psychological modifications only because we have first related through them to something other than themselves. The psychological modification is never what we're primarily aware of. It is the means by which we are aware of something else. The second distinction is between instrumental and formal signs. An instrumental sign is a word or a portrait, a ribbon of smoke, and they must itself be known as an object before it can direct awareness towards something else. Formal signs, by contrast, are concepts, memories, mental images, or entities whose entire nature is to signify. They do not first appear as objects and then redirect attention, rather they exercise the semiotic function precisely by not appearing as objects, by being transparent mediators through which the mind reaches its term. Poinsot's point, which Cahalan considers is the key of the article, is that if the formal sign had itself to be an object of awareness in order to function as a sign, an infinite regress would result. One would need a further formal sign to explain awareness of the first, and so on without end. The concept, therefore, cannot be an object of primary awareness. It is the invisible medium of all awareness themselves. With these distinctions in place, we can turn to Wittgenstein's arguments. In section 139 of the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein begins to ask whether understanding the word cube consists in having a picture of a cube come before the mind. He observes that any such picture is itself subject to multiple interpretations. A picture of a cube could, by an alternative method of projection, represent a triangular prism. Positing a further inner picture to fix the interpretation is going to generate the same problem at the next level. Wittgenstein's conclusion, reinforced extensively in the blue and the brown books, is that the inner mental objects of this kind of thing do not explain meaning, or they do nothing to explain meaning itself, because they stand in as much need of interpretation as the outer signs they were supposed to interpret. An interior picture is just another instrumental sign, and an exterior picture would serve equally as well. Cahalan's response is very interesting. Wittgenstein's examples are, without exception, examples of instrumental signs. A picture of a cube is something one is first aware of as an object, something that can be taken one way or another. And that's precisely what makes it an instrumental sign, and precisely why Wittgenstein is right that it cannot ground meaning. No instrumental sign, inner or outer, can ultimately explain signification, because the relation of interpretation must terminate somewhere. But Poinsot's formal signs are not of this kind. A psychological concept of a cube is not something one is first aware of and then redirected by. It is the very medium through which what it is to be a cube is immediately present to the mind. The question of how to interpret it does not arise because it itself is not an object, requiring interpretation. Wittgenstein's regress argument then is quite strong against the instrumentalist theories of mental content, but it's going to leave Poinsot's formal sign theory, quite intact. Now, this leads to the most substantive problem that we can identify with Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein's argument that no mental entity could contain the whole use of a word is in the sections 186 to 188 of the Philosophical Investigations, and Wittgenstein presents the rule-following problem, or the Kripkenstein paradox, through his famous series example. When someone is given the instruction +2, and carries on the numerical series, no finite number of past applications is going to determine a unique continuation. If meaning the rule is a mental event, well, it would have to anticipate an infinite number of correct future steps, which is going to seem impossible for any finite mental state. And this is why Sola Kripke, in Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language, calls this the most fundamental challenge to any mentalist account of meaning. Now, Cahalan argues that Wittgenstein's puzzle here is the ancient problem of universals in disguise. The issue is not whether any mental state can contain infinitely many future steps explicitly, but it's whether one can be aware of an objective meaning, what it is to add to, that has the logical property of universality, of being instangible in infinitely many cases, without being restricted to one of them. So for Poinsot, objective meanings are abstracted from individual differences. They are cognitively universal, not because they positively contain an infinite set, but because they lack whatever would restrict them to a single instance. The property Poinsot calls non-repugnance for being true of many. It's not a queer metaphysical addition, but it's simple consequence of cognitive abstraction itself. So to know what an operation of adding to is to know something that in any instance of the operation is, without that knowing or that knowledge being confined to a particular instance. The Wittgensteinian regress applies only if one assumes that knowing a rule must consist in awareness of a finite list of particular applications, an assumption that supposes nominalism or conceptualism about meaning. Now, Poinsot's realism about universals is detailed in The Material Logic of John St. Thomas, translated by Yevesar Salmon and John J. Ganville, and I think Donald Hollenhorst, I'm pretty sure, holds that distinct extramental individuals can be sufficiently similar to the same objective value, abstracted from individuating features, and that is genuinely what each of them is. When one correctly predicates male of both Tom and, say, Al, this is not merely a project of subjective similarity groupings onto the world. What makes both Tom and Al members of the relevant set is that an extra cognitional value, being male, genuinely characterizes each of them, and it does so in a way that cognition grasps in an abstraction from their individual differences. Without this extra cognitional anchoring, set membership collapses into this subjective similarity space, and Wittgenstein's argument applies with full force, because any set of past instances could be similar in definitely many respects, so nothing in the past users determines how the predicate applies to future cases. The rule-following problem is thus, at its root, the problem of nominalism, the refusal to admit that objective meanings, generally universal in structure, are what our cognitive relations terminate in. A further argument Wittgenstein raises concerns the temporality of mental states. He asks when understanding occurs, comparing it to the measurable duration of pain or hearing a tune. Cahalan observes that this supposition that mental states explaining language must be temporally located, in the way directly observable objects are. But if you think about it, formal signs, precisely because they're not objects of primary awareness, cannot be temporally measured the way that pain or tunes are. A written sentence, as Poinsot notes in the Tractatus de Signis, acquires its status as an actual sign only through understanding it as a sign, and that understanding is a reflexive and indirect object of awareness, not something temporally assailable independent of the act. Habitual knowledge, knowing chess, or maybe knowing how to read, right, is not this kind of occult process running alongside conscious activity, but it's an acquired psychological disposition that constitutes a readiness to be cognitively related to intelligible objects in certain ways. And that's exercisable at different degrees, and in different manners, without any single moment on the onset being determinable. Cahalan's deepest contribution is the convergence he identifies between Poinsot's anticipation of seeing as, and Wittgenstein's own analysis of it in Part 2 of the Philosophical Investigations. Poinsot in his Tractatus de Signis argues that the use of a sign requires only a single act of awareness. The mind moves to the sign and to the thing signified in one and the same cognitive motion, because in the awareness of one relatum, the correlative is already given. Wittgenstein independently concludes that meaning is not a process accompanying the use of signs, that intention with which one acts does not accompany the action, and that experiencing the meaning of a word is connected to the concept of seeing as, rather than to be any separate mental process. Both thinkers converge on the conclusion that the awareness of a sign as a sign is identical with the awareness of its significant. The sign is seen through to what it signifies in a single cognitive act. And that Poinsot reached this conclusion 3 centuries before Wittgenstein, within a fully developed metaphysical account of formal causality and relational ontology, is a very interesting, or at least good evidence, that Poinsot's semiotic framework is not just something that we should be curious about or something we can kind of just brush under the mat, but it's something that we should consider to be probably the best and most adequate way to at least understand signs and the semiotic frameworks that we at least have available to us today.